so now that we pulled the brakes apart on our 2013 Mitsubishi Fuso Canter, it is time to give them an inspection, make sure everything is in spec, and put them back together. Couple of quick things that we want to check once we get this apart and cleaned up. Remaining shoe thickness, make sure that your springs are all in good condition. Check out your ABS sensor, make sure that it's not damaged. Check your bearing running surfaces, make sure there's no pitting or scoring on the bearing running surfaces. Inside the drum, you want to measure the inside diameter, make sure it's within spec, and check out the ABS tooth ring, make sure there's no damage there. Now there are a couple of parts that you're going to need in order to complete this job. You're going to need 2 inner seals and 2 outer seals. Note that when you receive the boxes you might be a little shocked, but there are 2 seals in the inner box and only 1 in the outer. So when you only get 3 boxes and you're expecting 4, that's just the way it is. The next step is going to be removing the internal seal. For this you're going to need a seal removal tool. Now if you don't have a seal removal tool, I have done this with an Allen key and a pair of vice grips. You just got to make the same shape. And you simply slip this underneath, give it a bit of a pry, move around, give it a bit of a pry. Now, this is why you need to replace these seals, because this is going to completely destroy this seal as you pull it out. So just keep working around, and as you work your way around, we'll start pulling the seal up, and eventually you'll get to a point where it just pops out. Keep an eye on what the bearing is doing in behind there, because you're actually pulling against the bearing. There we go. That seal goes straight in the garbage. Next we're going to pull the bearing out. It's pretty simple. You just pull the bearing out. And what we want to do is remove all this nasty old grease from it and repack the bearing. And at the same time as you're repacking the rear bearing, you may as well repack the front bearing. I'm not going to show that process because there's tons of videos on YouTube on packing bearings, so check out that if you don't know how to do it. But really what we want to do is get rid of all the old grease in the bearing and fill it with new grease. And once you're starting to re-grease the inside here, what you want is the grease level to be just above the edge of this lip, so that when the bearing is in there, it's up against the back of the bearing race. This is a little simple tool that I decided to use, and it works quite well to get that grease packed back into the recess in between the two. Gives you a good idea of whether it's actually full up to the lip or not. So if you run that around a couple of times, you can see where the little air pockets are. You can get back in, push the excess back into the air pockets. Now keep in mind, this is only going to the level of that lip. So once the bearings are back in, you need to go around and do this again with the bearings in place to make sure that you're getting your grease right up to the back of the bearings. But this gives you a decent idea that you've packed it in fairly hard into the recess in the hub, that you're going to not need to be packing too much more grease in once you get the bearings in. A little bit closer view here without that plastic pipe in place. You can see that the void in the center here between where the outer bearing race is and the edge of the inner bearing race is now packed fairly uniformly with grease. So the majority of this is at the level that, very close to the level that I need. Once the bearings are in, I'll probably add about 1/4 inch of grease to that just to get it to the level of the rollers. Next thing to put in is the rear seal. Before you put it in, lightly grease the area, and as you are putting this in, you really want to make sure that you are pressing it in evenly so that it doesn't go crooked. For this you need your next special service tool, which is a piece of plywood to keep it from going in too far. What you're going to do is gently tap all the way around evenly, making sure you're not smashing your fingers, and once in a while lift the plywood back out, take a look, make sure everything's even before you continue back on. You can kind of feel when it starts going crooked. Again, just double check every once in a while. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but I'm overdubbing this and the video is running twice as fast and it's really hard to keep up. So basically you're going to continue this process of tapping it down a little bit at a time, making sure you're not smashing your fingers. I'm really not hitting very hard here. Probably don't even need a hammer. This is just a very light tapping. Again, once in a while remove the wood, make sure that you're not down to flush yet, and make sure you're not going crooked. Slide the plywood off to the side just to make sure you're not going too far. You want to end up with these surfaces all even, and once you get to that point, you're good. Next, we're going to slide the drum part way back on, really taking care that you're not knocking the outer bearing out of place while you're doing this. Again, we're not going on all the way. We just want to get things started. And hopefully after this, my microphone starts working again. So we've got the bearings greased back up. We've got grease packed in the inside of the hub there. And the next step is to gently reinstall the drum, and they want you to stop when you're 20 millimeters out, which for me is about the width of a finger and happens to work out to just around the edge of the indicator holes in the shoe. Now that the drum is on to the 20 millimeter gap back there, what I want to do is put my thumbs on the bearing here so that we make sure that as we push this in further, the bearing travels in with it so the drum doesn't go off center or crooked. So gently pushing in, my thumbs are on the outside of the bearing here, and I'm just there we go, gently pushing in. Now we have threads exposed here. We're not in all the way, but I can get the threads on here so we can press everything in as one. Next piece of the puzzle, the main washer with the little tooth in it. And you really need to make sure that when you put this in and this starts going in, that it lines up with the inner slot in the center. If you start pushing this in and that tooth is not in that slot, you will break that tooth off. Next up is this nut. You definitely want to be starting this by hand. Do not put your service tool in there and crank it on. This is a very fine thread, and it's going to take a number of attempts to get it going straight. There we go. You do not want to be cross-threading that. Special service tool back in there. Probably can do most of this just by hand. All right, push this in. If you feel any resistance, you want to pull it back out and make sure that that washer is in the right place, because if you force this together with that washer not in the groove, you're going to be getting a new washer. First torque, once you get everything snugged up, 110 foot-pounds. So, sorry, 110 to 130 foot-pounds. I've got my torque wrench set at 120. Right there. We're going to make sure that there's no interference and the drum spins nicely. Give it a couple spins in each direction. Then what we're going to do is we're going to completely loosen this again. So special service tool still in there. Back it off completely. Give the drum another spin. Let things reset. And we're going to retighten this to between 37 and 44 foot-pounds. I'm going to go right at 40, which doesn't really sound like it's that tight. But remember, all we're doing is keeping the wheel on. It's not that important. There we go. There's 40 foot-pounds. Right? Now, with the bearings set properly, the wheel should spin with between 1.4 and 2.9 foot-pounds of force pulled directly along this line here. So if you've got a force gauge, hook it around a stud, wrap it around, and when you pull this way, it should start to move between 1.4 and 2.9 foot-pounds, which I guess is really just pounds. So now that we've got everything set and our torques are correct, this goes back on. And this should line us up. We should have at least 2 holes that line up, which we do. If you don't, there is a procedure in the manual on what to do. I believe you loosen the nut in order to line up with holes, but you're going to have a hard time not finding holes to line up with. Somewhere around this ring, they're going to line up. So those are lined up, and this is basically preventing that nut from turning because of the flat on the axle housing there. Well, now of course there is one last step to do. Now that we've got it reassembled, we do have to go in and readjust the clearance in between the shoe and the drum. As you recall, in the beginning we had to loosen off the adjusters to get the drum to slide off, so we now have to readjust to make sure the clearance is correct. In order to do this, you are going to need a feeler gauge, your special service tool number, 7, and a flat blade screwdriver. And the way we do this is by removing an access port plug on 2 locations on the back side of the drum backer plate. So using a flat bladed screwdriver, locate the rubber plug on the back here, pop that out, save it with your other ones, and then through this hole you're going to insert a feeler gauge. It takes a little bit of playing around, and what you want to have your feeler gauge is 0.0079 or 0.2 of a millimeter. One last tip, when you are measuring clearance here on the top, you need to be adjusting here on the top. And when you're measuring clearance down there on the bottom, you need to be adjusting on this side. Well, that's all I have for this round. I hope that helps someone put things back together and give you a better idea of how the inside of these brakes work. If you like this kind of content, please click on subscribe, consider sharing the video, give us a like, check us out on Instagram, and stick around for the next video.